Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back, my dearest sisters. This is UK Islamic Mission's Ramadan 2025 series, where we are doing 30 juz in 30 days, inshallah. So we are completing a summary of the entire Quran. For those of you who weren't with us in our previous sessions, just a quick intro about myself. My name is Dr. Batul Hussein Wali. I have been involved with UK Islamic Mission for a few years now, and alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I've had the opportunity to dabble in various projects that they have running. By profession, I'm a medical doctor. I studied in East London, and now, alhamdulillah, I am working up in Northern Ireland. So inshallah, we'll begin today's session. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. We are covering Juz 5 today, which is essentially a large portion of Surah Nisa. So the way that we will proceed is we'll do a quick intro, recitation of Quran, and then reflect on the verses. So in terms of the introduction, I will just do a brief overview in case anyone's joining us new today. We have a theme. The theme is relationships, and we are looking at the Quran in that light. So we are deriving lessons specifically about this thing. If you've been with us the past few days, you will notice, and even today you will notice, a lot of the verses have commandments with regards to how we should build our relationships and our social networks. And then the verse ends with a beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because these two things are linked. When your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is good, it will teach you how to behave with the people. So without further ado, we'll begin with recitation of Quran and then continue with the session. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه نكفر عنكم سيئاتكم وندخلكم مدخلا كريما ولا تتمنوا ما فضل الله به بعدكم على بعد للرجال نصيب مما اكتسبوا وللنساء نصيب مما اكتسبن واسألوا الله من فضله إن الله كان بكل شيء عليما ولكل جعلنا موالي مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون والذين عقدت أيمانكم فآتوهم نصيبهم إن الله كان على كل شيء شهيدا. But if you avoid the great sins you have been forbidden, we shall wipe out your minor misdeeds and let you in through the entrance of honor. Do not covet what God has given to some of you more than others. Men have the portion they have earned, and women have the portion they have earned. You should rather ask Allah for some of His bounty. He has full knowledge of everything. We have appointed heirs for everything that parents and close relatives leave behind, including those to whom you have pledged your hands in marriage, so give them their share. Allah is witness to everything. So some of these verses we are going to touch on more deeply throughout the session. But inshallah, we'll begin from a little bit of a different place today, because I think it's important to have societal context, because it gives us more appreciation really of the revelation that we have received from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I have a chart, a graph on the screen, and it is to do with health essentially. Perhaps if you have young children in the room, you might not want them present as we discuss over the next few minutes, but I think it is very important in terms of the verses and understanding. That's why I put it up. So we have a graph, that shows sexually transmitted infections. So these are health problems that you get, and it's passed on through intimacy. And what the graph is showing, if you look at the bottom orange line, let me just get a pointer up. So if you look at this line here, it shows that every year 500,000 new people get diagnosed with an STI. And now I want you to imagine what that means on a practical level. Think about the anxiety that person goes through, the worry they go through when they start developing symptoms and they don't know what's happening. Think about the time and effort they expend to seek treatment. Think about now on a more of a societal and organizational level, how much money gets poured into infrastructures, gets poured into health clinics so that we're able as a country, as a nation, as a community to provide care for these people who then get these illnesses. It's a lot. It's a lot of time, effort, energy gets poured into this. Now, I have another graph, and inshallah soon you'll understand why I'm showing you this. This is to do with divorces. It's data from 2021. These graphs that I'm showing you right now, they are readily available from gov.uk. So it shows divorces, and when you file for a divorce in this country, you have to give a reason why. So if you look right at the end here, this kind of dark blue color, these are divorces that happened, and the reason stated as to why they're getting the divorce is adultery. So one or both parties cheated on the other, and that's why they filed for divorce. So it's a good sort of 8 to 10% here. So it's split into males and females. The other reasons are to do with separation, this sort of thing. But you've got a good 10% or so is all to do with adultery. Now, in terms of that, is all of that data is cheating and adultery inside the realms of marriage. But as we know in this country, the majority of people who are in a relationship are not actually married. So what about cheating outside of marriage? There's no official surveys about this. So I just looked at a few different sources. So we have a graph here where the values are very high, going up to about 50% of people admitting that they have had an affair whilst in a committed relationship. And then actually, sisters, when you start looking into these things, you'll find amazing things. Did you know that there are private investigator companies specifically for this? What they do is people hire other people to go and investigate whether their spouse is cheating on them. Now imagine the emotional toil that a person goes through when they start thinking like this and they get worried that maybe their partner is doing something like this. And those companies have also released data, and they've said that roughly 1 in 5 people in the UK have admitted to having an affair while still in a committed relationship. Now, why am I showing us all of this? It matters. Our societal context matters. Why does it matter? Because if you look at this paper in particular, it quotes something called infidelity costs. So this is how they reference it in this paper, and inshallah we'll bring all of this information together in a minute. It says that essentially when it comes to this kind of zina and cheating and infidelity, whatever you want to name it, it has a cost. It has a negative impact. It affects people psychologically. It affects the person's family and friends. It has ramifications extending to education, employment. It is not something, because it's sold to us like this, that is something is your choice, you do it, it affects you. No, when an individual behaves in this manner, it affects everybody and everything around them. And it doesn't just affect the individual in a small or minor way, it affects them then throughout their life in every sphere of their life. So what is the solution? The solution is marriage and to stay away from zina. And the reason why I have given that entire backdrop and I've given this facts and figures is because when, as religious people, as people who have faith, when we say that you should get married, people, especially who are not practicing, particularly people who are not Muslim or don't ascribe to a faith, will think it's unnecessary. Will feel that, well, what's the need? You can fulfill all your desires outside of marriage. But actually, the solution is marriage. There is a problem here, and we need to recognize and accept that there is a massive societal problem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses marriage in a great level of detail in Surah Nisa. So, other women are lawful to you so long as you seek them in marriage with gifts from your property, looking for wedlock rather than fornication. So, everything we spoke about before was fornication. So we come to Surah Nisa. The verses before this verse talk about and they clarify who it is forbidden to marry. And then and it also describes how to manage the dowry. And then it says this. And it says this in a very interesting way. Essentially, marriage prevents zina and it regulates desire and it makes it honorable rather than just fornicating the way that animals would. And the framing of this verse is for those looking for wedlock, for those seeking chastity and not to have zina. It talks about marriage in an honorable way. It's not about lust. It's about people who are looking to get married to avoid haram, to avoid that haram and to keep things clean and to keep things pure in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is really important for us nowadays to understand that, especially for our younger generation, but these are issues that are probably rampant across all generations, that the purpose of marriage is to keep things pure, to prevent you from falling into these issues. So if you have already fallen into these sorts of issues where you are already in haram relationships, obviously marriage is a better step, but in the first instance should be that you are trying to keep yourself pure. A lot of people nowadays are going into this with the mindset that I will date, I will do haram, and then at the end I will marry the person and then everything is fine. No, it's not a stepwise thing. We don't fornicate, we don't commit zina, we don't go into these haram relationships where you're texting, when you're spending all this time together, even though that you don't have a nikah, you don't have a marriage contract. You do everything stepwise, and the end step is marriage. No, we stay in halal throughout. So then the verse sort of continues. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives very many rulings to do with marriage, and then it comes to this point regarding change. And I want to talk a little bit about change because Ramadan is a month where many of us make life-changing decisions and we really change the entire trajectory of our life. And we live in a society where there are so many problems, actually. There's a lot of good, but there are a lot of issues as well. And the question really is, and the question a lot of the times, sisters, we end up asking ourselves is, can I make the change? We feel very overwhelmed. It is hard. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 28, and it is Allah's will to lighten your burdens, for humankind was created weak. And this is a beautiful verse because it shows us that after all of these rulings, especially we just spoke about zina, and I don't want to get into it in too much detail, but we are all human beings and we all understand what desire is and what lust is and the power of emotional pull towards something. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this. And what it teaches us is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands our nature. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. And therefore Allah does not ask more of us than we can manage to do. So all of this is a source of motivation for us, because when it comes to these rulings and these injunctions, and sometimes we think that it is too much. I can't do that. That's not for me. I can't imagine every day for the rest of my life waking up for Fajr. I can't imagine being the person who prays 5 times a day without missing any salah. I can't imagine being the person who always wears hijab whenever there are non-mahrams around, even if it's a wedding, even if it's a family event. I can't imagine being that person. That seems too tough, too hard for me in my context, in my family, in my environment in which I'm living in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says these injunctions, these rulings, they're not a burden. Allah wants to lighten our burdens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to take off of our head all of these pressures, all of these societal pressures and cultural pressures that we have put onto us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to lighten our burdens because He knows us. He created us and He knows that we were created weak. And because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that, we should have more confidence in ourselves that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a ruling or asked us to do something, that means that we are capable of doing it. Now, I have a question for everyone here. It is Ramadan, so I'm sure we can all understand. I'm going to ask a question. What does it feel like to be hungry? What does that sensation feel like? Being hungry, I know we've changed topic, but again, we're going to loop back. Being hungry is often a signal that we need food, right? And it is not a pleasant sensation. Now, if we move on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about craving. So there's a difference between hunger and craving in the English language. We won't get too much into it in the Arabic just because I want to keep this accessible to everyone. Craving is about dopamine hit. Craving, when we crave something, it's not normally something that is particularly good for us. We don't usually crave eating vegetables. We normally crave eating something that isn't great for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, do not crave what Allah has given some of you over others. Rather, ask Allah for His bounties. This is a very interesting verse, especially in the time that we live in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that men and women will be rewarded equally according to their deeds. So we know that this life is a test to get to the hereafter, and the thing that goes with us is our deeds. So if we know that our deeds are being rewarded equally, then what more could a person possibly want? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing this, that sometimes maybe we will have this craving, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us no. Everyone has their share of life. And instead of looking at what someone else has, turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because why? And again, we see this verse to do with our relationships with other people and our relationships with Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, when we interact with other people, don't get obsessed with what they have. Don't start thinking about the way, and we're women, so this is something quite common in women, but men have it also. Don't start thinking about what they're wearing. Don't start thinking about their jewelry, their house, how their kids behave, how their spouse behaves, how often they went on holiday. All of these little things that shaitan whispers into our minds. Don't crave what they have because Allah gave it to them. Turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, in this verse, Allah is telling us, ask Allah for His bounties. Ask Allah. Specifically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this talks about men and women. So not women to women or men to men. Specifically, men and women. Two separate examples given here. And it almost implies that men shouldn't want and crave what a man has, and a man shouldn't seek what has been granted to women. What have women been given? They have been given a guarantee almost from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of security, of comfort, of being provided for by their mahrams. That's what they have been given. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given different positions, different ranks, different blessings to different people and different types of people. And so instead of looking at the person, look at the source, turn to Allah. And when we start doing this, You will find more sweetness in your relationships with people because you're not going to be in competition mode. This is from Shaitan. Shaitan whispers these little things to us, and it creates bitterness and sourness in our relationships. If our understanding of Allah being the provider is there, then we will not have this issue. So then shortly later in the verses, Allah then describes what He has given to men and what He has given to women. So one of the things we mentioned is that men are the caretakers of women, right? So this is something that women have been given in a sense. There's two ways to look at it. Men have been given the responsibility to take care of women, and that means that women have been blessed with the fact that there are men in their life who will always be the ones that will look after them. And this has been skewed. I don't want to tangent too much, but this idea has been skewed and presented very negatively in the world that we live in. But I advise all of you sisters to go volunteer somewhere, do some voluntary work, speak to people. And when you start speaking to people, you realize what a huge blessing this is. When you speak to people who are homeless, when you speak to women who have no one to look after them, absolutely no family, no friends, no one, they may have children. When you speak to women who are struggling, when you speak to women who are working because they have to work, because their husbands or their fathers or their brothers or all the mahram in their lives are telling them, no, you have to provide for yourself. Speak to non-Muslim women and see what their lifestyles are like. Speak to them and find out how many of them genuinely are doing something because it is the thing that they love doing, and that's why they've gone into a profession. And how many of them are doing it and working full time because they have to. You'll be surprised. You'll be very surprised at the split, because I'm telling you, there's not as many as you would think who are doing it out of love and out of passion. Most of them are doing it because of the economy. That's what you'll hear the most, subhanallah. So this is a blessing, that men are the caretakers of women, and they have been, as men have been provisioned by Allah over women and tasked with supporting them financially. And on the flip side, what is our responsibility? And righteous women are devotedly obedient, and when alone protective of what Allah has entrusted them with. So there is a commandment to the men in this verse that men, you have to look after women, if we paraphrase very crudely. And what have women been instructed to do? Devoutly obedient, and particularly when we are alone, to be protective of what Allah has entrusted. And what has Allah entrusted us with? It is discussing essentially our private parts. We guard our private parts. We don't engage in that kind of behavior. And again, sometimes we look at these verses and we think that these are talking about extreme matters, and it doesn't really apply to me. I wouldn't do such a thing, but subhanallah, sisters, shaitan works and he chips away at people until they get involved in things that you would never imagine yourself to get involved with. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word essentially to protect. When you protect something, you have to protect it from all angles. So subhanallah, it is incumbent to protect your private parts, to guard them, to not fall into zina. But what about essentially sexuality? What about when people go to work and they talk with their body, they move their body in a certain way, they laugh in a certain way, they maybe flirt a little to get ahead? We should be mindful of how we speak, how we interact with other people. I won't go back, but the statistics I was showing, it is very interesting when you look at the breakdown of how people fall into zina. It's normally it's either an old friend, someone they've been friends with for a while, or it is someone they met in the workplace. And subhanallah, I think if we reflect upon that within ourselves, I think one of the main reasons that might well be is because we think we would never. If it's a workplace, it's a professional environment, I would never. If it's a friend and we, being friends with the opposite gender in of itself is questionable, but if it's a friend, then we think, oh, I don't have any feelings for them, they're just a friend. So we need to just be mindful. Shaitan doesn't say go do this extreme thing. It's the chipping away of your values and your morals. We need to be firm. So subhanallah, men are entrusted with the security of women, and women essentially, we are entrusted with the security of our own selves, to protect ourselves. So we'll move on inshallah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then describes marriage. So as you can see, Surah Nisa is all to do with sort of spousal relationships and relationships between men and women. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about marriage and reconciliation in marriage. So this is when say you're having a tough time with your spouse and you're thinking about divorce, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the advice that Allah gives. If you anticipate a split between them, appoint a mediator from his family and another from hers. So essentially get a person to speak on the husband's behalf and the wife's behalf so they can mediate. And here is the beautiful bit. If they desire reconciliation, Allah will restore harmony between them. Surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. This is a massive lesson for marriage, but it is a massive lesson for any close relationship. Allah is saying that if you want reconciliation, Allah will restore harmony between them. You might be on the brink of divorce. That is a horrible spot to be in. It's the lowest of the low. And there could be many, many things that could have been mentioned as a solution. Many advices could have been given, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is essentially saying mindset. That if you want to fix this situation, if you want to fix it, if you're willing to fix it, if you're open to a solution, then a solution will arise. Allah will make it arise. And the nature of the mediators is that they mediate to try and find a reasonable middle ground. So there's a few things to be noted here. One, you need to have a decent mediator. And in order to have someone decent mediating for you, sisters, you have to surround yourself with good people. You have to. And we've come back to this many, many times. There are so many verses alluding to this. But you want the person speaking on your behalf to be a good person. And that doesn't happen out of nowhere. It happens when you surround yourself by good people. And I've said this once and I'll say this again. This doesn't mean that you run away and you get rid of all your friends and you start finding new ones. No, it means that we work on each other, that we bounce off each other, that we try to improve and we improve the people around us, because that's how a society works. That's how a community is formed. And the other interesting thing is if they desire reconciliation, if you're open to reconciliation. The reason why I point this out is because in an earlier session this week, we discussed this idea about wisdom. And the idea of being wise is that you are open to change. That true wisdom is being open to receiving good. And so again, we see this. In order to have healthy relationships with people, we need to be the ones that are open towards ideas and open towards change. Otherwise, we'll stagnate as human beings. And Ramadan is an excellent example of how much progress we can make when we're open to the idea that we can make progress, that we can move forward as a person. So moving on from this, so after discussing marriage and relationships and these sorts of ideas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses money. And again, you would have noted over the past few days, when it comes to relationships, there is a lot of mention about money, because money matters, sisters. Money affects relationships. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 37, indeed, Allah does not like those who are self-deluding, boastful, those who are stingy, promote stinginess among people, and withhold Allah's bounty. Allah does not like stinginess. It's a very clear-cut verse. To not be stingy, to not withhold Allah's bounties, to not promote stinginess in people. What does that mean? I think, sisters, we all intrinsically understand what it means to be stingy. Nobody is saying to give outside your means. We all have our own, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written a certain amount of risk for us, and we are all managing within that risk. We're all living within the cover that Allah has given us. Alhamdulillah. Stinginess is at the extreme. It's at the extreme end. The reason why I mention it particularly and why I thought it would be a good verse to discuss is because sometimes we can get so caught up with our ritualistic types of ibadah. They might be excellent. The amount of nafil prayer that we're praying, the extra fast, all of this. But we read this verse, it says Allah does not like stinginess. Allah does not like those who are self-deluding, boastful, those who are stingy, promote stinginess. It's very clear. So we might be doing so many other things right, but when it comes to our money, our behavior is not appropriate. Sisters, for example, say there is an event, perhaps at a masjid, a charity event. There's food left over. There are people who are more in need of the food, but are you at the front of the queue to take it? Allah does not like people who are boastful and stingy. So these are people that perhaps Allah has given them a lot of wealth and it has gone to their head and they withhold from the people. Why might this happen? And again, it's that understanding of Allah and that understanding of wealth and how to interact with it. Sometimes we are doing quite well financially and we get very attached to that money because we think we have earned it, so why should I give it to someone else? But actually that is self-deluding, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alludes to in this verse. The wealth has come from Allah. You've worked for it, but the wealth is from Allah. So you have to divide it and give it in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained. So I'm not specifically speaking about charity here. I'm speaking about who has a right over me right now. Is it my children? Is it my spouse? Is it my parents? Who needs, where can I invest this money so that in the hereafter I reap the reward? Sisters, we've come back to money a few times and I will just say again, money affects relationships. Money affects relationships. Money is not just yours that you have by yourself and it's in your bank and nobody gets to see it. Money, your attitude towards money will make or break the relationships around you. If you have trouble with your relationships, I would say the first thing you should think about is how do I interact with people in terms of the money that I give or withhold. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moves on. We're now at verse 46. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has come back to the discourse of the Jews. And so at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, some Jews take words out of context and say we listen and we disobey. May you never hear. So essentially some words in Arabic sounded very similar and they would say something and distort its meaning. So instead of saying we listen and we obey, they would say we listen and we disobey. May you never hear. Playing with words and discrediting their faith. Had they said courteously, we hear and obey, listen to us, unzurna, tend to us, it would have been better for them and more proper. Allah has condemned them for their disbelief, so they do not believe except for a few. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the Jews in this verse and talking about how they used to twist what they were saying. You know, they would pretend to say we listen and we obey, but they were actually saying we listen and we disobey. They were being rude, they were being disrespectful, they were making a mockery of the religion. And then after this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually told the believers what they should be saying so that when the believers said we listen and we obey, it's very, very clear. So you've got the Jews on one side twisting their words to be disrespectful, but then later the believers are told what they should be saying so that their words, at least the believers' words, are very clear. What do we learn from this story? We learn to differentiate yourself from people like this. Do not let there be ambiguity in where you stand in a matter. You should you should be very clear. At the end of the day, the believers were saying the correct statement, right? But they still got told how to change what they were saying just to make it 100% crystal clear to everyone there that what they were saying is respectful. So we learn the importance of etiquette and the importance of using the best words, the clearest words, and making sure there's no ambiguity in what you stand for. To be clear cut. And that is a thing of honor. This applies to so many things in our life, sisters. To be clear, to make sure that there's no ambiguity in where we're standing on something. It goes from our behaviors to how we name our children. Give your children excellent names and allow them to be recognized by those names as Muslims. There is a bit of a trend, a bit of phenomena, if you'd like, to give children names that are ambiguous so that they can get further in life, so they're not clearly. No, sisters, be clear. Be clear about what you stand for. Be clear about what your children stand for. Don't try to blend in these kinds of matters. There shouldn't be ambiguity. Apologies. Okay, we'll move on, inshallah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses how to manage disagreements. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses to when you judge between people, judge with fairness. To judge fairly, sisters, in disagreements means that you have to be objective. So if you've got two friends and they're having an argument about something, you have to take your emotions out of it and you have to be objective. But the only way we can do that is if we accept and understand that we are a human being and that we might have some emotion and that we might be fallible. And the minute you realize that you are a human being and you might be fallible, then you have the answer to that problem, which comes in verse 60, obey Allah and obey the messenger. Should you disagree on anything, refer it to Allah and his messenger. So I hope that makes sense, sisters, that when we judge between people, when you're trying to mediate between arguments and disagreements, you have to do it fairly. And the only way you can do it fairly is to refer it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. You can't bring that on your own head because you are always going to be emotional. You always are going to be emotional. You're always going to be a human being. You're always going to be fallible. You can't be 100% objective. So therefore, you have to refer it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. That's the first port of call. When someone has a disagreement and they come to you, the first question you need to ask yourself is what is actually correct and what is actually wrong. And then go from there. I wanted to talk a little bit more about loneliness because it comes up in Surah Nisa, and it's come up in the previous verses we've been doing on the previous juz, this idea that as Muslims we will be tested, that as Muslims we might be mocked, that as Muslims this, that and the other might happen to us in the dunya and we might face difficult people. But then in Surah Nisa something beautiful is mentioned. And whoever obeys Allah and his messenger will be in the company of those blessed by Allah, the prophets, the people of truth, the martyrs, and the righteous were honorable company. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reassuring us that in the dunya, you might be practicing by yourself. You might be making a change in your life and being the only one. You have to stand up for what is right by yourself. But this is the reassurance that we won't always be alone, sisters. We won't always be alone because there will be a day that whoever obeys Allah and his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be in the company of those blessed by Allah. One day we will have the company of the prophets, the people of the truth, the martyrs, the righteous. We will have honorable company Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reassuring us that by demonstrating high moral character, by being that one person who tries to do the right thing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is elevating our personalities. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching and training us and making us into better people so that one day we will be in the company of good people, inshallah. So on that note, with regards to being practicing and the trials of being practicing, we come to verse 72. There will be some among you who will lag behind, so that if you face a disaster, they will say, Allah has blessed us for not being there among them. So there will be some people in this world who, when they see you go through difficulty, so first you are facing the difficulty, and then when they see you go through that difficulty, they will say, well, good thing, good riddance that I wasn't doing what they were doing, because Allah's blessed me that I'm not among them. So this was actually with regards to warfare, but we will apply it generally today so that we can gain benefit from it in our day-to-day lives. Sometimes, as a religious person, as someone who's trying to practice, you will face trials because that's the nature of the dunya. And one of the tricky things is sometimes people will look at you and say, because you were practicing, that thing happened to you, and I'm glad it didn't happen to me. I'll give you an example. Say you apply for a job, but you don't get the job. There will be people who will say, well, like, that's because she covers. Oh, I'm glad that I don't cover. I don't have to face those problems. There will be sisters amongst us today who wear full hijab. They cover the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to. And maybe they're having some difficulty getting married, for example. This is very common within our community, this kind of backwards ignorance mentality that people will look at people who are having some difficulty getting married, and they will say that, oh, it's because they are practicing. They are too strict with their salah, that they cover. Nobody wants to marry someone who's covered. All of these things. So number one, you're going through a difficulty, and then number two, on top of that, people will attribute your difficulty to the fact that you're practicing. Subhanallah. And this is the twofold trial of being religious. And society has a particularly negative eye whenever they see someone practicing face any sort of hardship. But we know, subhanallah, that that is not the case. That is not the case, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then addresses that in verses after this, basically saying that no, that's not the case, and that is not why that happened. The nature of the dunya is that it has trials, and the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's bounty and reward is that you will be rewarded for what you do of good, regardless of what the people say. You will be rewarded for what you do of good. And so, inshallah, that actually nicely, alhamdulillah, brings us on to our appeal today, which is our Ramadan appeal for this year, today even, and it's to do with providing clean water. So, inshallah, if you have the funds, please do donate what you are able to donate so that we can help with this crisis, that there are people out there who don't even have clean water to drink. Subhanallah. Some of the things that you can do are long-standing in terms of, say you donate for a hand pump, then you will be rewarded every time someone drinks from it. There are water well projects, and you can build an entire plant. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually in Gaza. Subhanallah. So in conclusion, we've talked a lot about the trials faced by the people who are practicing. We've talked a lot about the different types of people that you will come across. Today in particular, because it's Surah Nisa, and this is a massive topic within Surah Nisa to do with marriage and reconciliation between spouses. And I hope, inshallah, that we found some benefit and that there is something in this that has touched you. So please think about at least one thing from today that you can take with you and try to apply, inshallah, to your day-to-day life. That concludes today's session. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.